uneven effects of globalization, but also of themes like climate change and what has already been said, of course, the pandemic. So when we look at the development of cities or of change, we have to remember that we have territorial, social, political, cultural, and economic spaces, which have a direct, sometimes an indirect, but often a direct effect on the way we see cities themselves change or adapt to the larger sort of context roundabout. That would be the first point. The second point is, of course, that, which just to sort of framework the complexity, is that all these different areas are, of course, intertwined. And therefore, we may find that the effects of climate change is affecting socially, employment or human rights or whatever, more in one area than the other. That I'm going to stop at that point for this sort of, it's just to remind us that, you know, we very often concentrate on one area and don't see the way that other very important challenges are intertwined with what we are doing. So to finish that kind of introductory thought, we have to remember that our own knowledge of the effects of change are very, very fragmentary. We tend to sort of know bits, but not know others. And that is the kind of background frame to the way we have to look at cultural diversity and the change of cultural diversity in our own cities and also, of course, societies. We've always seen migration. We need migration. We are celebrating diversity. And yet at the same time, we know it would be too simple just to paint a positive picture and not see what these kind of push and pull effects of migration are meaning in a deeper sense. They are very much tied up to the dialectics of change, which I've just tried to very, very shortly, as an introductory statement, remind us of. So it's not as if migration takes place always because people want to celebrate diversity in a different country. Very often they have to move. And on the other hand, of course, the way they find cities that they come to are very, very different. Are they regarded as a group of migrants who are welcomed? When I look at the German situation, just as an example, we had after the as from the middle of the 50s, we had what we called a pull policy, because we needed migrants, we needed migration. And I can see that Nekla Tessa also joined us. I see the pictures, hi. And of course, one of the major contracts at that time was with Turkey. And it was a contract between both countries. So that is a kind of a situation which is very different to a situation where migrants come because they need new space. They have the situation of either conflict, so that we have, of course, all the asylum seekers, the refugees, the effects of natural catastrophes or whatever. So I think when we talk about intercultural cities, we have to advocate for, first of all, for a proper monitoring of the different effects and the different waves of migration, which have to be integrated. So it's not just a simple case of looking at integration of the so-called host country and their population in a city. It is also a case of integrating the different waves of migration. across generational change and across the different groups of migrants, which we have in our cities, who sometimes compete with each other, or they don't understand each other. So we have, I think one of the main points I would like to make about intercultural cities and their living with difference is that we don't know much and we don't understand enough about the difference in intercultural city space. We have to appreciate more. Also, the fact that, of course, we always find certain structural sort of frameworks within cities. For instance, if we have a city which has, as I've just used the German example, we don't even have the same kind of startup sort of constellations in all German cities. If I just stay with the situation, we find a difference between the East and the West since reunification, because in many of the Western German cities, we had what I told you about the so-called guest worker policies, which did not do what they could and should have done for integration. But we have partly learned from the lessons made then, but we still have to see that these are starting points of the structures which have evolved. We find that very much cities which are multicultural, partly due to urban planning or the lack of looking at the way urban planning is inclusive, that we then have certain areas of the city which are with one ethnic group or with one religious group. So when the next generation comes, they tend also to go to this area. And we find then it is multiculturalism in the sense of not being really intercultural. A big kind of area that we have to look at. If I look at the city of Berlin, for instance, we have there, of course, the immediate border to East Germany. So on the east side, there was no migration until, or not very much migration until after the 90s. We had then integration. We didn't have integration. We had, of course, through the reunification, a different situation, but we did not have the practice of meeting with other cultures. So there was no dialogue of cultures in the east of Germany. And we have seen that the structures are very different between both areas. The other, I should perhaps just speak very quickly about Stuttgart, where we had the situation that very early, also already in 2000, 2001, I was very much part of this. We developed an integration concept, and part was not just looking to see the structural differences, the social differences within the city. For instance, how many of those who had migrated in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s had school leaving education and school leaving qualifications when they left school? And what was the demographic development? And we found that the city was losing its educational abilities because the number of young people without school leaving qualifications was rising, because it was seen to be those who, they were the migrants, which of course is a very shortened and a very expensive way of not adhering to or not looking at the effects of non-inclusion. The non-inclusional effect of not having educational school leaving qualifications affected the economy, it affected the urban surroundings. It affected the way that intercultural dialogue was possible or not possible, very often because it was also the ongoing next wave of migration where, again, people would come to an area, they would work in the companies. The women often did not work and did not speak the language. So you see, it's a very, very intertwined kind of set of situations. The city of Stuttgart then very much both from bottom up as well as top down, developed an integrational process, also setting on the change of corporate identity, saying we are a city of international, we are an international city, we are an intercultural city. And we have to look at the responsibilities from the top down area of setting up institutions to increase the intercultural capacities within schools, to set up the way that we teach language, and the organization of meeting spaces. That also involves urban space as a place of living, not just the place of meeting in the marketplace or in the leisure place or in schools where, of course, you have to meet, but also in the neighborhoods. And I think these are some of the very practical questions that we tend not always to look at. If we look at Berlin again, we have whole areas within Berlin where young people almost never leave the quarter where they live. So it would be exactly the opposite. There is no space because the schools, the marketplaces are so organized in the separate urban quarters, which are so big on themselves that they are self-sufficient. So how do we organize meeting space and develop really what we look at as celebrating diversity, but at the same time, taking on the challenge that many of these areas and many of these groups are not interested in, the challenge is how can I protect identities and also convey that we have many identities. We have an identity in the family, in the living quarters, but we have other identities as belonging to a whole society, as belonging to a region, which defines itself as being intercultural and international. I think this is maybe one of the main questions that we have to look at when we talk about organizing a knowledge base of exchange to see where are the challenges and where are the chances, and how do we interest those to both from top down as well as from bottom up to be much more differentiated in looking at the very dynamic process of challenges and chances. Maybe I can stop there and we can look at the questions we want to look at. But my point is that cultural diversity is always looked upon as both a threat to some. I think very often also in the generational question, that one generation is, especially in situations where we find that migrational groups have not learned the language of the city they have lived in, we find a next generation has been born into being bilingual or more than bilingual, but at home we don't always have this situation. And so it is seen as a threat if the next generation has a different set of lifestyle, but also of very hardcore basic tools to be able to move around. And of course, the very first is always language and understanding the diversity of cultures in a country I have come to. So I'd rather try to look at the question of neighborhoods, and maybe I should I'm sure we'll get to this in the debate and the conversation we have. I think we have to see that, of course, prejudices and stereotypes can be very obvious when we have the politicization of ethnic identities, which we are seeing at the moment, unfortunately, also through a very professional, connected area of social media, which is suddenly intercultural in a way we don't want them to be intercultural, because of course they connect across regions, across cities, but that is not our definition of what we mean. So how do we look at that kind of question with social media as a chance and a challenge? And the other thing is, how do we connect the positive networks of, for instance, we see with the white papers from already in 2008, of course, with intercultural cities, but with also the networks of intercultural cities, which I've also seen when I looked at it just a while ago. We see for a huge number, I think 147 cities are actually involved in the Council of Europe activities of intercultural cities. So when we get back to the city itself and to the more practical level, how do we connect and use the knowledge that we have in different networks, both of best practice and of worst practice? I always mention worst practice. And how do we convey it to the area, of course, of NGOs, of institutions at the local level, from schools to industry, to local councillors? How do we manage to convey what is important? Can we focus on emerging themes as being urgent? And at the same time have a long-term or a short middle-term strategy of continuing, so we can really build on the knowledge we have? Because my experience is we know a lot, but then it suddenly breaks down. There's a new theme there, so we don't have the continuity which we need really to develop what we mean by a kind of, well, not just a kind of, but Selbstverständnis, I'm thinking in German again, but the sort of having to understand that society changing as it is changing, whether we like it or not, as I read recently with a network of social culture, we are becoming international. We are certainly diverse. And I think most of us here celebrate the diversity, but we have to realize many do not. They see it as a threat. So how do we move on to interest and to sort out a kind of priority of what the issues are that we must look at first? I'll stop there and hope I've been able to say a few things that people can catch on to, and we can then develop a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Caroline. Very, very, very interesting intervention and very interesting speech. I have a lot of questions about it. First, about how climate change can affect the interculturality in the city, as you mentioned, that the climate change affects the different. Do you want to hear all intervention and then we ask the question, or do you want to make one by one, as you want?
Maybe if there's any urgent question, otherwise I would really suggest going on and then developing a conversation. I think, so if there was an urgent question, because I know I sort of jumped around a bit then, but I was hoping that when we have, knowing that Ingi and Stefanos are going to touch on some of the things I touched on also from different perspectives and probably more practically, then I think we can maybe develop a conversation altogether.
No problem, but just I would like to have to ask a question. Can we consider that the difference is part of being human, Dr. Caroline? Because you mentioned that the difference is now the other and the degree of acceptance of the other and the difference of the other is a sign of civilization of any society or any city. As you mentioned, the difference between East and West in Germany, and you are different, but you form one country and you form one culture, mean that the culture is composed by differences. And how can we talk about protection of identity without our identity should be protected or should be developed? Yes. We have the same identity as 100 years before. Our identity developed and is composed by different influences. Yes. How can we protect and in the same time develop our identity? Just this question, and then we give floor to.
Well, first of all, to start off with, I think, of course, that identities are first of all formed in what we call the formative years of socialization. So we are formed by the communities we live in, and that nowadays may be just a neighborhood and not a whole society, or not a whole culture or religious affiliation or whatever. But our identities, if we keep to the individual level, change over time, depending on where we work, where we go to school, how a corporate identity of a region or a country influences us and whatever. But also at the corporate level, the identities of regions or of societies change over time. They change gradually, very often that we don't notice them. For instance, if we then define ourselves, or a city defines itself and has an image of being cosmopolitan or doesn't, these are many effects that go into to do that. Second question about difference, and I think, of course, as you introduced me, difference is a cultural difference, and cultural variety is a value in itself. And of course, has to be protected. We know from UNESCO, we do our very best to look at immaterial values, immaterial cultures, but of course also the built or the natural. We want to, of course, support and also protect cultural difference. But we have to also realize that does not mean everything. Doesn't mean that everything that has been culturally mainstream at one point in time can continue as being recognized as an attitude or a way of behavior or a way of thinking that we always protect. I used to say, well, you know, if I had been born in the Middle Ages in Scotland, maybe I would have been burnt as a witch. Yeah. So, you know, we don't want to, we have to make sure that we have, as an international society, we have our conventions on human rights. We have many conventions which we don't really adhere to. I mean, if we look at the violation, the violence against women, all these issues, we have to always be careful that it is not said, oh, this is because it is culturally, it has always been like that, and so it has to be protected. You know, I think we have to separate these different strands of what is cultural difference. And we have to educate, and we have to also really have a conversation so that everyone understands why certain areas must be protected and should be protected, but others have to change. And I think the whole question about gender mainstreaming, for instance, is extremely important. As we know in the Anna Lindh, we want to look at the question of women and youth and see that some areas of change are not sort of politicized by the argument of culture, because in fact it's not a question of culture in the sense of what is often said by a politicized, manipulative way of trying to define what has to remain unchanged.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Dr. Caroline Inji. We are very impatient to have your input on this very important topic and the vision of one very important active woman, Mrs. Inji Murad Fahim, is an Egyptian expert from Alexandria, the beautiful city of Alexandria, former elected member of Egyptian parliament, and also one of the first women joining a new parliament after the revolution. How lucky you are. Interested in politics and changing society.
Very much.
The post-revolution Egyptian society, a strong believer in education and cultural exchange impact on individual and societies, lawyer with a master's degree in law studies, academic university experience in business law and human science, doctoral researcher in international commercial law and intercultural intellectual property law, and the most important job that you are a mother of two beautiful girls. So welcome with us, Inji, and floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anis, for this lovely introduction and presentation. Well, another beautiful morning from Egypt, dear guests and participants. I'm very delighted to be joining this webinar and discussing with you all this wonderful topic about intercultural cities and the concept of living together. I'll be speaking today from a perspective of a former member of the Egyptian parliament for the past 5 years. I'm a strong believer in education, as Anis said, but it's broad the meaning of the term and in intercultural exchange impact on societies. I have joined the parliament in 2016, and here I got the chance to focus, analyze, and understand more about our Egyptian society, of course, in interaction with executive bodies and administrative bodies and all stakeholders. So regarding our topic, I don't know if all participants have visited Egypt or not, but as we all agree that Egypt is or represents a real image of an intercultural nation with the diversity found among its cities and among its people, we can find a real diversity. It's by history and civilization. If we'll be focusing on Cairo, definitely it's the capital, it's a center of business, tourism, culture, diplomacy, history, etc. But on the other hand, Alexandria is where it's the city where I come from, represent a real example of a cosmopolitan, Mediterranean, multicultural city, as French people say, belonging to the berceau of l'histoire de la Méditerranée. And how can we find this intercultural effect on our city or cities, intercultural cities, on two levels? First, the infrastructure, in historical sites, monuments, etc. But on the other hand, we can find this effect on traditions, on values, on languages, on cuisine, recreational services offered to the community and to the social cultural groups, where we can really find and distinguish the existence, or sorry, the coexistence of different cultures. But in order to a very high level of social integration, I'll be very specific in my presentation and focus on objectives that we need to really target. And I have listed a number of essential tools that are aiming our three objectives. Number one, in order to achieve a high level of social integration, we need to raise public cultural awareness in intercultural cities. Number two, we need to fight racism and discrimination by raising fundamental values. Number three, we need to manage with sustainability, and I'll put under the word sustainability maybe 10 lines. We need to sustain the diversity of our society through government reforms and all stakeholders. I have to note in that context that Egypt, after its second revolution, have issued lots of reforms and initiatives in that direction. I'll be stating some examples, but of course I'll not have the time to be stating everything. Regarding our first objective that we definitely all agree, the raising of the public awareness on the level of cultures, we have two kinds of public awareness. Number one is the general public awareness, and number two is the cultural awareness for each city, its history and origins. So the word identity is very much considered in this part, but also the origins of each history of each city, has to be very clear in the societies and in young generations. So I will start with education as a vital source of awareness. It is always an important and fundamental tool, and it satisfies my three objectives. It enhances knowledge, of course, and the reasoning skills of all young people, and it induces, of course, exchange and interaction between individuals. So all the ministries, I guess, the government, civil society have to work and take into consideration and as a priority inserting and teaching fundamental values and rules of discipline, teaching history and different cultures, teaching different languages, promoting groups activity like sportive and artistic, all kinds of cultural activities. We need to insert technology as it's a tool now for exposure, for an individual exposure, and quick learning definitely. I think that cultural exposure is a main factor for bringing open-mindedness, creativity. Creativity is very important. Learning, accepting, and respecting. Scientific exchange is a must. Sightseeing for young generations. They have to be knowing where they are. They have to be focusing on who they are. Who are they? So I'll stop here to note that education was our president or remains our president priority in seeking those aims by education. Egypt has launched educational reform in 2018 in cooperation with major international partners. And I'll stress on major international partners because this is a typical example of intercultural impact or intercultural cooperation. So European Union was a great partner, or still remains a great partner. The World Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO, UK is a main partner for education. USA, France, Germany, Japan, China, Spain. I'm inviting everyone, please, we can use this opportunity to read about our educational reform since 2018. The existence of a diversity in education systems is very important in each society. It's a great tool for expanding diversity and increasing public awareness, social integration at the same time. I'll not speak much, but I have to note also that Egypt have hosted and is opening its doors to almost all systems of education. We have the British, the American, the Greek, the Canadian, the German, the Japanese, and even religious schools like Catholics and Al-Azhar schools. So again, for those who didn't really read about Egypt, I'm inviting everyone to read about it and about those initiatives started since 2014. During my mandate, I have issued a very interesting bill of law for regulating and facilitating the establishment of international universities. We even hosted British concerned parties to be formulating the best outcome in our committee. And it was a really interesting experience. The exposure of young people, their training, cultural exchange are definitely tools for cultural awareness. Bringing international dialogue in place. Cultural events are very important. We have to use our cultural centers, public spacing, public festivals and events in music, art, movies, theaters, and promote sports everywhere. If we'll be speaking about COVID-19 circumstances, I would say that those events have to be online with a strategy for motivation. And this is very important. Motivating young people will raise their tendency to awareness. So government also need to adopt programs for cultural awareness, but we have to put into consideration that some places are more vulnerable and need more awareness as rural places, for example. So any reform, any initiative, even from the civil society, have to be focusing on places where we need to expand more public awareness. And here I will note and I will announce our latest, biggest reform launched by our president for developing Egypt rural places and areas. And I'm inviting really to have a look on it because it's booming those days and all stakeholders are really focusing on it. So raising cultural awareness about history and the origins of our intercultural cities on the public local level and on the administrative level, because we need, I'll speak about the challenges I had through my experience in the parliament. I found that lots of employees and administrative employees on the local level, they don't know what's meant by heritage. They do not appreciate and evaluate our origins through our buildings. And our origins are our identity, definitely. And through all this, we can reach the social integration we are all looking for. We need to create spots of entertainment and attraction for young people in those old characteristic places. People will be more familiar with their places, with their history and origins, as I said. Well, maybe Stefanos will agree with me about the great initiative called Nostos. And the president and the government have launched a great initiative about bringing back the roots of Greeks and Cyprus from Alexandria. And it was a really big event. And I was happy because it got published and people knew about it. And for me, this is a quite great example of public awareness too. I will not speak much about all the initiatives, but I'm inviting you to look at the restoration of our royal ancient Cairo, the Islamic area, the cemeteries of Jews, the Fustat place. So there are a lot to be said, but I will save the time for other thoughts. Another good point is the engagement of young people in cultural activities. It's very important to engage those people, volunteers, in how to raise their own awareness. And I'm inviting you also to be looking at a really great Alexandrian young man who's called Muhammad Gohar. His project is mainly on publishing what's called the description of Alexandria. He goes in the very small streets, very small cafes, restaurants, and pictures, and just speak about the origin of each place. And this, for me, is a really a positive and promising example for our social awareness. Popularity and interaction of local famous artists and actors with their origins, and those have to be engaged with the modern society as well. Finding a good network on the social level also helps in public awareness. Definitely NGOs and civil society are main actors. in all those thoughts, and definitely social media and press are magical tools in raising this public awareness concept. Okay, number
Thank you very
two.
much.
I did not
Yeah.
finish, and please leave me just maybe 5 more minutes. I will be focusing on the tools for fighting racism and discrimination. Beside education, I've spoken about education a lot, but in my opinion, there are 4 fundamental values that we need to rely on, and policymakers and lawmakers and leaders have to take into consideration. Number 1, humanity. Number 2, equality. Number 3, tolerance. And number 4 is acceptance. And I will just, from the perspective of a parliamentarian, as a legislative role I've been practicing, if our constitutions, and yes, our constitutions are stating clearly those values, then they have to be published and popular to everyone. Because once we know that equality is here for all, and all the rights are given to all, no matter what differences are, and the equality in opportunities exist, then everyone will be knowing his rights and obligations, even for small groups. It's a kind of a relief, satisfaction, trusts. So lawmakers have to rely on these fundamental values as well. And law executors have to understand rules of law in order for them to be able to protect all groups, whatever their culture or backgrounds are. A state of law is a must for regulating diversity and achieving social integration. In my opinion, if we fight corruption, then everyone will have this sense of righteousness and satisfaction, then you will raise trust, and definitely and automatically, naturally, you will have this social integration coming in our places. And our parliaments have to be very active in that direction, and I witnessed a real active parliament since 2016. Definitely we need more. And when we speak about women empowerment, I believe, sorry, young men, but a voice of a woman represents a number of voices.
I'm totally.
So Dr. Carolina, I experienced this myself. So I believe that it is very important for governments to practice their controlling role and legislative, of course. Finally, to finish my part and my objectives I'm really believing in is the tools and strategy that have to be undertaken to manage diversity. And the word managing diversity is it refers to sustainability. We cannot manage diversity unless having great vision and reforms to maintain this social integration. So government have to keep an eye on the society and monitor changes. There has to be a tool or another, maybe a national organization or something, but monitoring culture and social changes, and I mean social behaviors, is a must. We need to measure, are we intolerant or tolerant societies? It's very important. And I will bring back the concept of fundamental rules that we need always to bring to our place by using different tools. So number 2, the integration of all cultural groups in society have to be taken into consideration in policies and project makers. We have to make a place for everyone: habitation, transportation, workplace, education, business, and more. A really great example of this part are Syrian people coming to Egypt, mainly Alexandria. I can tell that they're really booming in business. The restaurants, Syrian restaurants, are really various, and we can see them really succeeding. Myself, I don't eat Syrian or shawarma, except from Syrian and Lebanese restaurants. Now, this is a very small example because we have seen Syrians and Lebanese and Jordanians and different cultures coming to our city, Alexandria, in the past few years. The participation of all cultural groups in cultural events and activities is very important as well. A simple example I have witnessed during my mandate. I was invited in chorals for the Christmas carols in one of the Catholic churches. I guess they're Greek Catholic, and I had all government representatives around. We had someone from the government, someone from the local office. So it was marvelous because we found ourselves all sharing and participating this lovely cultural, religious event. So I'll be back to the government cultural programs that have to be kept sustainable, definitely. A very important point here, the channels of communication have to exist, have to be easy and accessible between leaders and people. It's very important. For me, communication is a key. I have also witnessed this during my mandate when people from different groups, from different cultural groups, even French senators and French diplomatic people representing French citizens in Alexandria, where we had really great and fruitful discussions. So, I mean, communication is a must and it's very efficient and it brings people all together. A very positive remark here is to say that during my mandate, we have discussed a very important bill of law for a decentralized administration. And I guess that decentralization, I mean, perfect and great communication have to be on ground, on local levels, in cities. And I guess we will never have anyone rejected or anyone non-integrated. I'm almost done. Please keep your energy. So a sustainable, inclusive climate in organization is also definitely a great tool for increasing social integration. An inclusive climate in organization, we need to have training employees and we need to have good cooperation with international bodies and organizations. And also I'm inviting you all to just have a look and have a look on this cooperation between Egypt and l'ENA. l'ENA is the École Nationale of Administration, and it was a really good cooperation step, a protocol, an official one with the president in order to increase and train the leaders and increase their competences and all workers in the administrative bodies, and I was very happy about it. Maybe a point that sounds less important, but I believe that consumers play a huge role in social integration. An open market for business and products have to be everywhere. I mean, products of every country have to be on shelves and found everywhere. So investments are very important also for our social integration. Government need to seek a strategy. No, I have just 2 minutes because I'll be raising a very big question and I think it will open a very interesting debate. So, sorry, Anis. We need to promote tourism with different strategies as well.
We will cancel Stefanos, no problem.
Okay, sorry, Stefanos. You know, Egyptians are talkative. And I have lots of energy from the past experience in the parliament. We used to debate this way. So I'm so sorry. Give me 1 more minute. So the pleasure is mine. Thank you very much. So I believe in business and I believe in investments, of course, tourism. I believe in the strategies undertaken in drama, theaters, and cinema. They're fundamentals also for raising sustainable cultural awareness. Government has to engage as well the private sector, civil societies, foreign communities in all the reforms or in all their projects. The civil society has to work in cooperation with the government. No, I'll say let civil society work freely on a condition that the government have to facilitate, encourage, and support NGOs and civil society. Finally, in my opinion, we can make use of our diversity. It's an asset to our human resources. I guess it's an asset to this bunch, or we can make a coalition, as we say, of intercultural experiences and knowledge. But I have a very small or a very big fear, and I'll turn it into a question. The fear and preoccupation, and maybe Dr. Carolina has mentioned a part of it, is when Egypt or any country receives unqualified immigrants or refugees and vulnerable ones, and for Egypt, we need to offer all kinds of services. This is a question, does this will really slow down the rate of development? We're speaking about sustainability and we're speaking about durable development. So, and the other question here is so much related. Does immigrants' expectations could be really an obstacle and a threat for social integration? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angie.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stefanos.
No, Stefanos,
Thank
you
you.
your intervention. Okay, Stefanos? No problem. No, but really, I just mentioned that it's very important to see that we know that the concept of interculturality is based on different concepts in each country. Immigration in Germany seeing difference on the basis of own culture, and in relation to education. I note the public awareness in your intervention, NG, sustainability, education, and the role of government to maintain this sustainability. Do you think that we are or we have you note about the public awareness and general public awareness? Do you think that we have some society who have this predisposition to be more intercultural or not, even they have since, because you note the history and the role of the history of and the civilization of your country in this concept of interculturality? Do you think that we have, it's more easy for some society to be more intercultural than others, or not?
Do you mean on the practical and social level? Do you mean between citizens?
Because you mentioned,
please clarify your question.
I'm sorry, because you mentioned that two very important things in your intervention based on the intercultural. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find my notes. How can we integrate the all difference? You mentioned that engage people and the origin, the general public awareness, and based also the origin of each city to show or to develop the awareness of each specificity. So my question now is, do you think that when we have multicultural origin, like, for example, Egyptian society, you have Copts, we have Arabs, we have etc. It's easier for the society now to integrate the concept of multiculturality or not?
Mm-hmm. I'll speak with I'll speak with examples. Allow me, Anis.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll do a comparison with other countries or cities. For example, in Egypt, if we are different in cultures, we can be walking and participating in one same event. This is happening in Egypt. But let me be very, very direct and specific. But since our education was not really taking its high chance before 2011, and since the old regime didn't work on a very high level of public awareness, as all the example I have stated, so I can tell that Egypt will boom with the very light starting from 2011. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
I say if Egypt since nowadays and since it's the origins of history until now, we witness a real intercultural, multicultural society by seeing differences in one place and coping perfectly together till 2011, then with all the tools I've mentioned and with this political administration's will in education and reforms in public awareness, then we will reach a high level. Thus, we might be different from other cities with intercultural effects.
Okay, okay, very understood. Thank you very much, MG. It was really, it was very interesting and big contribution. I go directly to our beloved Stefanos Valiantos, the head of our great Greek network, holds a PhD in international politics and Middle East foreign policy making from Lancaster University, and currently is heading the Department of International Relations of the Hellenic Foundation for Culture and co-founder of FOTOISA for Education, Research and Action. The big man, big Stefanos, is also the coordinator of the Greek National Network of the Anna Lindh Foundation, has taught Middle East and Balkan politics, participated in several conferences and gave lecture on Middle East politics, on the state of civil society in the Euromed and the Middle East, on civic education and on intercultural dialogue on city. He's a certified trainer on creative and social entrepreneurship and has implemented projects of cultural nature. His publications include volumes and volumes on the international relations in the Middle East political system and evolution of Iran, Arab civil society after the Arab Spring, ALF, and unique case studies of multilateral cultural diplomacy, Euromed civil society at the crossroad, and others. Thank you, Stefanos, to be with us today. We appreciate a lot your huge work with civil society, as we appreciate also the huge work of Caroline and MG. And we know very well your big role in this very sensitive and very difficult period. I just would like to remember all our guests and attendees that you can send your question by message, and we will transfer this question to our honorable guests. Stefanos, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Anis, for your kind words and over exaggerating of who I am. But thank you. A big man needs a big friend like you.
Thank you.
I hope that my time available to speak has not already started when you started. Okay, as I've said, I will try to give a little bit. I wanted to concentrate a little bit on, shall I say, the shadow side of this issue and bring back the issue on the cities level. And first of all, I would like to stress what Caroline said, is that when we talk about cities are completely different one to the other. This is essentially, if you don't consider this one, any policy that we'd like to implement is not the right one. The second one is that most probably we are still in the process of talking about best case scenario about multicultural cities rather than intercultural cities. So in that respect, probably the notion of intercultural cities should be the aim rather than the current condition. In view of this one, I would like to also make a different distinction, because cities or towns or spaces, or this one, they carry a different culture, a different dynamic, and a different interaction, whether we talk about urban or rural areas and cities or and towns. So this is also makes a difference. And the other element is when we talk about diversity in terms of the cultural element, this does include not only the ethnic dimension, but it also means a different cultural expression domestically to be found. And now coming back to the cities as such, I think my experience, at least the bigger they get, the more it has, what I would just describe, it can be read in a positive or in an optimistic or in a pessimistic way. These big cities tend to be impersonal, cruel, and difficult to maneuver in a certain way. This, on the other hand, this impersonality also allows for different cultural expressions. So I will stick to this notion in order to include there any differentiation from the main identity in such a way, allows them to in a way be more able to move and coexist in such a city. Now, I think in most cases, the smaller they get, the more difficult this diversity is, or the more difficult the coexistence diversity is, unless we manage to introduce interactions among them. Another differentiation I want to make is that in terms of the immigrants, I think, and Caroline mentioned as well, is that when we talk about the need to integrate them and in order to accept the diversity and the intercultural element, we are not talking about two different groups, i.e. the locals or the domestic population, the indigenous population vis-a-vis the immigrants and the refugees. Because of different waves of immigrants and refugees, at least this is the experience in the North and in Europe, then we tend to have different groups in terms of ethnic and religious orientation, which do not only not only friction, but any tension might exist is not only vis-a-vis the local or the indigenous population. In many cases, it's between them, because we come back to, let's say, the primitive elements of human beings' nature, and which is survival. And because of this cruel nature of the city, this becomes an element. So my life or my survival might be at the expense of your death in a way. I mean, just over-exaggerating, not because I'm not in favor of it, of course, but only because if we want to build a strategy, we'll have to be sure what kind of problems we'll find. Otherwise, it won't be possible. Now, in terms of dealing with them, dealing and trying to integrate them, definitely in that respect, the youth tends to be the more volatile and mobile within the city. In a different way, because the youth expression, in a way, it does create its own cultural or subcultural groups, or something that we tend to use very frequently. Among the youth, we have different tribes, and the notion of tribe has nothing to do with of course, the anthropological nature, but it has to do from music expression, from dressing habits, and other things, which we can find over there. The last difficult element in order to integrate them, actually there's another one, is the sustainability of those people who live in the city. And this is the notion of employability. If a city, if that's why, I mean, I'm talking about the city because this is the reference of today's webinar. If the city cannot manage to create new jobs, new opportunities, or ways to absorb those immigrants or those refugees of different cultures that do not have employability, then the tension would increase more and more. Because then it becomes the issue of survival, becomes the issue of threatening also the dominant culture's overwhelming presence, and so on and so forth. Of course, on the other hand, we can definitely argue that the identity of a city tends to be unique in a certain way. And this is an added value if you want to treat this integration at the city level. So in that respect, I think one of the strongest examples would be the Berliners, as we call them, but definitely cities like New York and London and probably Paris or others, they tend to have a unique identity vis-a-vis the rest of their own country, not only to include the others. So this might be a stepping stone that would allow for the integration of those newcomers in the city, because the point of reference and this identity is dynamic and always changing, can incorporate those elements in relation to an ethnic identity, which to be the dominant identity at the national level. Of course, Caroline, I think you did mention the notion, underline again and again, the notion of identity in the fluid nouns, but I would like also to mention, at least in between levels, we can have the multiple identities coinciding in one person, and the ability to move from one to the other and have to coexist one. The last point I want to make in the negative side is that probably also the nature of the city or the municipality is essential in dealing with them. And in that respect, a city which is metropolitan in nature, or the municipality is metropolitan in nature, can deal with it much more effectively vis-a-vis, for instance, Athens, but only, well, the city of Athens, the municipality of Athens represents probably not more than 30% of the actual size of what we call the city of Athens. So any policy that this city will implement does not cover the whole area, and because of of course the common space that exists in such a city with other municipalities, unless it is dealt collectively with all the municipalities of a major city, then we might have problems. The last one, and then I move on to the positive sides in a way. The last one is politics, and I'm afraid the national politics, be it parliament and otherwise, impose, in a way, they have the tendency to impose themselves locally. So in that respect, we have seen, at least in the case of Greece and Athens and other cities, that the rise of power of the Golden Dawn, which is the fascist political party, was much more effective in such cities, in major cities, and especially in areas where unemployment was extremely high, were capitalized on the presence of the immigrants and so on and so forth, even though in reality we pretty much know that the influx of immigrants and the refugees are essential for the survival of countries which in Europe, which are A, they are aging population, and B, they're used to a quite high level of a standard of living, where without such influx, we wouldn't be able to sustain it. Of course, this might create a different one, is that what kind of jobs those newcomers would can do. And I'm mentioning this one not on the financial aspect, not on the economic aspect, but on the social one. If you tend to have too many of them doing the dirty job, then their integration with other segments of society which do not coexist with them in that level, in that societal level, might be a question, especially in terms of the youth, even though the youth is much more dynamic. Now let's go back to a more positive one. I believe that there are two elements that we have kind of addressed in a certain way that I would like to stress in more importance. Like Angie mentioned the education parts, you mentioned, of course, the need to implement certain strategies and policies. But I would like to stress here two important ones, which would have to be addressed to both the indigenous population and the newcomers in setting, with all the other aspects that I've mentioned. And this one is developing or introducing and training them in intercultural dialogue competencies. And the other one is civic education. Not only, you might argue there's intercultural citizenship education per se, but I will stress the notion of civic education, because the civic space that they coexist each one of them has its own dynamic, its own rules, and therefore being a citizen of a city means something important. And this goes hand in hand with what Inge has mentioned in terms of your rights and your obligations. It's not only the rights, it's also the obligations. And of course, the importance of stressing or making sure that there is a large body of common values shared by all those groups. There is a certain point that might be of importance, is that in some cases, like in Athens, a large number of those who come into them are of transitory nature. This means that they are not that much interested in being integrated, because that's not their long-term target, and they would like to move on to a different city. And this creates a kind of an issue. Yet, that still can be dealt with, because if we are talking about Europe, then in many cases, a number of groups in Greece have trained them in terms of language skills, for German, French, or otherwise on English, but also of the norms and values that exist in the European domain. Now, I will finish with just underlying, in order, until I reach the model that I see as a very interesting one, is that I think everyone has stressed it, that we have a number of institutions and that can and they should be involved in this process in order to achieve this one. And of course, the municipality is one of them, civil society is the one is taken for granted. But I would like, one of the things that I've experienced in Athens is that the importance of sports club. I mean, I've seen how, for instance, the Philippines communities are very popular in basketball, and this coexistence in such a team, especially in team sports. This is essential because it creates the fraternity that they need. It makes them that realize they can, and they should, and they can depend on each other, and this opens the way for friendships which allow a strengthened one. The other ones we have seen, which were very positive, were the festivals, music festival. The other ones, which are very nice, but I am afraid that in many cases they are beauticized. So you see that in a very large perspective, and imagine that in some cases the integration is not an easy task, because they might bring with it to radicalization, which to a large degree, and this brings it to the initial point I made, we have to make sure that the city can provide or can create jobs and opportunities to integrate them. The other one, which might sound, I think we have never really touched upon, at least in the northern side, is the importance of religious institutions, especially churches. The structure of a city like Athens or the Greek cities, they depend a lot on the churches in each neighborhood, and in many cases, the churches do a lot of humanitarian work. So not only because a number of refugees and immigrants are of Christian origin, but regardless of this one, this is a space that allows, in a very humane way, to offer, to stress, I mean, as a Christian from that side, to stress our obligation vis-a-vis our brothers or other human beings. And it does have a very good knowledge of the local society. Just as a FSFA argument, when we started, when they started doing humanitarian aid and offering meals to other ones, the church knows very well who would come because he wants the free meal and who would come and he needs the free meal. So this is a very positive way, just as included it. And of course the schools, but also it means in order to integrate newcomers, you need what they call the introductory schools, or in order for them to be integrated into the school system, they need to have gone through a process where their skills, their social skills, their language skills are a little bit higher, because this is one of the things we have seen, is that the fear that the quality of the school would be diminished because of the coming of the influences. Now, the second and third generation of immigrants, their educational skills and their language skills are even better than the Greek ones, but I'm just saying for the new ones. And I would like to finish with exactly the paradigm that exists, and I think we should actually duplicate it not only with regard to the cities, but also to intercultural dialogue policies, the model of the Council of Europe's Intercultural Cities Program. And the reason is that it's tailor-made to deal with specific characteristics, with specific cities, with a commitment and guidance for different stages that would lead to them. Also, always taking into account that we always have to go back and revise and see whether it brings fruits and adapt accordingly. Now, I will finish with this, and all that, if we apply perfectly, it doesn't secure success. So that's why we always have to bear in mind that we need to go back, we need to be patient and insist on it. And the last point I wanted to raise, even if things do not do as good as it functions, when we implement a policy, it needs a long time. And interestingly enough, in many cases, the success stories comes from completely unorganized events and processes. The dynamic of the city and the youth, they will follow, regardless of what you introduce, they will follow their own path. And probably if we offer the values that we need, let them work independently, individually, and beyond any collective work. But if they want to work outside the collective, process, outside the collective structure, let them do it. It's their life, and they know, probably they know better, even if in many cases, because this works instinctively. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. I hope I stayed just outside the time framework, but I hope that it was worth it.
Okay, it's okay, Stefano. Thank you for your very interesting contribution. I would like to remind those attending our webinar that they have the possibility to send their question on the message board, and we will also take intervention for those who would like to participate. I see our beloved Nadia, Merna, and all other colleagues and friends. Thank you for attending this very interesting webinar. If you have any questions, Nadia, do you want to have intervention or?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very exciting to be here today, and I thank you very much to the Moroccan network to have organized that, and it's always a pleasure to see you guys anywhere, even if it's only on the Zoom. So yeah, I have loads of things. It's so exciting. It's bubbling. I have to refrain from going extra. And please, Anis, stop me anytime if I'm taking too much time. So yeah, you know me. When I start, it's like you know, I just can go on and on.
Like all Moroccan.
So yes, I listened carefully to all your contribution, and I found so many great things. And each of the element could be a day workshop, to tell you the truth. And it will be absolutely fabulous if we could unpack a little bit more, because we have so much to learn from each other, and all our experiences could actually create something fabulous, because we have that experience, and we are all aware and well, let's say professional within our own realities. So that's the only thing that we could actually know for sure. So to start with is that I am missing the link really of the human right, although it has been mentioned. Let's say I tell you, I tell you about a little story. Arriving in Ireland 25 years ago, I was born in Casablanca from a Moroccan mother, a Yemenite father, grew up in France, spent 8 years in Bavaria, and then moved to Ireland. And it's 25 years ago that I'm living in Ireland. Ireland is the country I live the most when it comes to timeline, yeah? So I say as well, I actually lived in Ireland with an awareness that I didn't have when I was younger, maybe. So it is maybe here that I am more connected with all the knowledge I actually gathered, not necessarily so for that reason, I will say that I am nearly know a little bit more about Ireland than I will know about other countries. Although feeling wise, I will have a good understanding of the German system, a very good understanding of the French one, and a less good understanding of the Moroccan one. It seems I moved from Morocco when I was 6. So just to set the scene. Okay. When we started here, let's say I started around 2000 working on inclusion work in Ireland, because the scene was starting to change. And to know, Ireland, when I arrived, there was no Black person when I arrived in Ireland. I was looking all the street to find someone that is actually looking different, and it was not there. So it was very strange, and it changed, of course. And while the change was happening, we could see that when it came to policymakers, there was a big change that happened. The policymakers started closing a little bit up, because, you know, 2014, for instance, there was the new policy saying that women that arrive here as pregnant, when the child is born, if they don't have one parent that is, let's say, Irish, they cannot have the Irish nationality. prior to 2014, everybody born in Ireland could have the nationality. So yes, my work was mostly on inclusion, because we have the direct provision. This is a specific horrible system whereby refugees, asylum seekers arrives in Ireland are put in a specific system, knowing that a minor, when they arrived in Ireland, undocumented minor, refugee minor, were put in that same system. It's a room, maybe you will have 4 men in one room having minor as well in it, just so that you have an understanding about where I'm coming from. So we started doing all the, let's say, intercultural kind of capacity building, training with schools, training with different, even workplaces, because the workplace was changing. We were with professionals, social workers, giving them training on intercultural capacity building. Very soon we noticed that actually when we come at it as, well, let's be tolerant, let's share the dish, we are all here human, it did not necessarily brought a great change, let's face it. But when we started questioning history, we actually went to about this week, I don't know if you know, is the European Youth Week. Yeah, yesterday we were giving a talk on how environmental justice, and taking it from a racist lens, because it is important to understand that if some countries are actually fleeing, and if we have refugees, well, maybe we have to recognize as European our own doing. Because when you look at history and you look at the colonization time, when, for instance, let's say, if we take just one example, when Belgium left the Congo, a total of 3 Congolese people held position of responsibility in the government. When Great Britain left Tanzania, the country had 2 engineers and 12 doctors. So just to give you an idea about what colonies made happened in those countries. So we have now what they call the refugee flood, because terminology is everything when we talk about inclusion, isn't it? So we are trying now to take it from a human right perspective. It is, but as well by teaching young people about the history of what happened to those countries. Why is it that we think, when we think about Africa as being poor, it's maybe the charity model that has been created by diverse charity groups, and coming to the church, for instance, and the place of the church in the example of Ireland, for instance, where the African child was seen as poor. So when someone that is Black arrive in Ireland, the only narrative we have of that person is that that person is uneducated, have nothing to bring us, and that's the problematic. We cannot, for instance, I have a good friend that is highly educated, that is actually in a position of power. When he walks on the street, he said, "I'm just a Black man." And when people talk to me, they think I'm here a refugee, because when they see the color, they associate it with it. So it's actually about, yes, awareness raising in the country, but awareness raising in the meaning that you make understand first the recognition about the responsibilities we all have as let's say European, and as well to understand that we are coming at it from a humility space, yeah, and not and as well a human right perspective. So it is important, when you bring that awareness in the space, that you move away from that tolerance terminology to human right terminology. When it came to your question, Anis, that you had, I think, and Caroline, if I may just mention Mary Robinson said, the climate change is the greatest threat to human rights in the 21st century. And yes, we know in Europe, as anywhere in the world, since some of the countries, over 190, signed the SDGs, We know that we moved from the MDGs to the SDGs because we recognize that we have poverty in our countries as European. We have difficulty with the health system. It's not working. So just one final things. Well, I had for everyone, but I go to just finish with the Stephanos. When you say that there is a problem of recognition of diplomas for people arriving as a refugee or as migrant. I can go on, and I have made some lists, but listen, thank you very much for giving me that space to express a little bit what it's all about for me.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, to discuss with you. Very, very interesting. Yeah, of course, it's a problem of stereotypes when we are talking about Africa. For example, for us, from Tunisian people, when they ask me, where are you from? In America, for example, I said from Africa, but why you are not black? I said always it's in the south of Italy. It's always better, you know, sometimes for understanding. So I give the floor to Nivin Wagdi. Floor is yours, please.
Yes, hello. It's very nice to be here with all of you. Thank you, the first while, for all the speakers. It's a great debate and a great information about all of us. I want to introduce myself. I am Nivin Wagdi. I am working as a cultural development program. Basically, we are working in our Upper Egypt governorates, in the villages, in the most emerging areas. So I have 2 points here. I have just 2 minutes, don't worry. First one, I believe in that the basis of an effective cultural exchange is an appreciation and respect for what each one has of cultural, and knowing that each individual has an added value that he is able to provide to others. This is a very important point. After that, I would like to share our experience in Egypt, in Upper Egypt specifically. We are working with the children. We own certified schools in civic education. So it's very important, and we are to open their minds to their societies and the world, and presenting their points as a free spaces to view their dreams and what's in their minds, and also provide them with a safe space to practice their rights and talents and express them freely and the creativity through theater, singing, and various artistic performances. Actually, if we provide our, I want to confirm in that if we provide our children the space of freedom, we can make them make many experience in interculture. So it's very important to provide you and confirm with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nivin. I give the floor to the head of Moroccan network, Mr. Wadia. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Anis. Again, to our guests and colleagues and partners. So cities have always been places where people of different origins cohabit, interact, and share many common goals in spite of their differences. In this sense, there is nothing new about the phenomenon of intercultural cities. In recent years, however, the increase of cultural diversity in many cities has led to increasing concern about inter-ethnic relations, social inequality, and racial discrimination. One response to these challenges has been to focus attention in intercultural policy and practice. Intercultural policy is generally to initiate that raise awareness about the advantages of diversity, but also seeks to reduce the impact of discrimination at the same time as it encourages positive interactions between people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. Intercultural policy has become a dynamic area of research and policy design. Certain cities have made significant advances in the domain. Now, in the context of COVID-19 and the measures of physical distinction and the restriction of mobility, the practice of intercultural dialogue in its structured and unstructured forms now takes place mainly on online platforms. This development has facilitated and sustained much needed discussion across cultural, religious, ethnic, and socioeconomic boundaries. The need for dialogue in the context of COVID-19 is increasingly felt because the pandemic has not only exposed vulnerabilities and inequalities, but has also given rise to new forms of discrimination that call for urgent action by activists of civil society. This is the question now, how to manage intercultural dialogue, especially in intercultural cities, to face this discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadia, for your intervention. Do you have more requests? Mirna, you raise your hand. I feel it.
Thank you. Thank you, Anis, for moderating this great session. And thank you for all the speakers for this amazing webinar. It's really a good intervention from all of you. Thank you, Wadia, for choosing this topic. It's a very important topic. It's intercultural city. It's very important in our society to discuss this. I think to reach intercultural city, we need to make a lot of strategies. We need to combat hate speech, to combat discrimination, to spread the dialogue as an important tool for all the people and for the youth. And we need to focus on the youth because the dialogue is very, very important to reach intercultural city. Thank you for you. Thank you, Anis. That's what I think. I think the speakers, all points I wanted to mention about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirna. You make a great job with the network, Egyptian network, and congratulations for all your big project. We will finish soon our very interesting session. I would like to just before to conclude, give the floor to our honorable guests to close their remarks and to react with the different intervention of our attendees. And I have some question when we are talking about international cities or intercultural cities. When we are talking about the role of religion, the role of the government to develop the interculturality, when we are talking, when Nadia talk about stereotypes, about colonialism, and about the vision of other, how we consider other as equal or as not. So that's some reflection, because as Nadia said, it's each of this topic can be developed as a workshop or as a symposium, etc. So I give the floor 5 minutes for each of you, Caroline, Inji, and Stefanos, then we will conclude our very interesting webinar. Caroline, please.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. First of all, also, I think both to the other speakers and of course to those who have commented and also asked questions, I think we can see what an important topic we are speaking about, and that it is very much an ongoing. And I would like to also again underline it is not a linear development. We have disruptions many times over again in different contexts. And this means, which has been made, which I also made, we have to monitor, we have to look at what's happening. And I think really that is one of the most advantages and the most important advantages of making sure we have participatory, inclusive cultures, because those on the ground are the first who notice that something is changing. Let me just, for instance, when I look at what Nadia was saying and her very interesting cosmopolitan biography, you know, if I compare the situation of what she was saying about stereotypes and the way they change, for instance, with Ireland not having any colored people or black people in the streets, that is very similar to Germany, where, especially in East Germany, where you don't have colored people or black people, and or very little. And if you do, then they're asked, where do you come from and how long you're staying, kind of thing. And it's very slow process until they become, you know, sort of integrated into higher positions, into media, into very visible positions, and are part of society, which I think is more, of course, with colonial backgrounds, the case in UK, but not without setbacks and not without discrimination, of course, which we know. So there is no easy question, but I think one point is certainly if there is no meeting and meeting places, then you certainly have this question. Another point I'd like to make also in that vein, because I think it's important, the point of, which you also made, the point about citizenship. And the question of rights and responsibilities. If you don't have full citizenship, then you don't have the same responsibility. You're not allowed to have the same responsibility, which is a different way of sort of looking at that. And so I think this whole question within cities, in a city, at least there, being part of the civic in the city, it is usually easier to have, in that sense, citizenship. And that's one of the things we have to look at when we look at inclusion. I think it is also very important, which we haven't talked about today in detail, but we did indirectly, the difference in demographic development, the aging in Europe, the young, a very young population in the southern countries, which means the whole question of tying in social development and perspectives for what young people are going to do is very asymmetrical. And we have to look at that more within the sort of city and civic situation that we're aware. Awareness has been a big question today. So that across the shores and between the countries, we know about awareness of the very different situations of youth. And it was also a very thanks to Morocco, of course, and Badi, because of the question about the situation which we are seeing and only beginning to recognize through COVID-19. It connects us in many ways. It makes our vulnerabilities and our interdependencies visible. It shows us what we can do with social media, but it shows us exactly the opposite also.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe just one very last point is we have to realize that another point is within our societies, there are always groups which popularize stereotypes, and especially when we know we have elections coming up, then we suddenly find the popularization of non-inclusiveness, which I think we have to be very careful about. So I think it's a very important and ongoing question, and thank you to everybody who
Thank you very much.
learned a lot from. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Inji, floor is yours for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Anis, and thank you for everyone, interventions of everyone, Mirna, Nadia, Naveen, thank you all. From my side, well, all the interventions have popped up some questions for me. I believe that state of law is answer for lots of things. We need to stick to state of law because rule of law is here to regulate relations between everyone living on the same land. The biography of Nadia made me a bit confused about my meaning for identity. I thought, and I'm opening it as a question, I thought that identity is who I am. It's the same way as for states. It's where am I born? Who are my ancestors? Where am I born? Then my nationality, origins, and my beliefs. We'll not speak about the beliefs. All others, acquired knowledge, experiences, are self-investments. I mean, there are additives to the identity. And here comes the challenge. How are the states, the challenge for states, how to securize or protect the identity of the state while seeking high social integration for all, especially that Dr. Carolina, I agree with you, all countries are open together now. And yet the question of state identity is a challenge. I'll just mention tolerance as a question. I am a believer in tolerance as a fundamental value well learned in educational institutions and part of public awareness program. But the question is, what about tolerance if we harm others in one society? And here comes a really very important point of the safe living of people in one land. So Nadia, tolerance and human rights, I agree 100%. I'll not go in depth in what Egypt has confronted as during our revolutions, but tolerance and a safe environment, definitely they correlate. Stephanos, you have mentioned that churches have to play a huge role. From my experience, I'm a Coptic Egyptian, by the way, but I stress on the cooperation of churches and the whole society and the government, because allow me to say that before 2011, I guess that every single question that raises a discriminative issue in the society is a taboo. So when the church starts to integrate, especially young people, they're refusing it, by the way. And I guess that churches have to find their other strategies to encourage and attract young people for praying and for raising the beliefs only. But churches, I mean, the whole society has to cooperate together. We can never reach social integration unless all axes of the community are working together. And finally, I am very curious about human rights. And as a legal practitioner and someone who is really interested in law, and I have been facing the human rights question since I was in the parliament. I'm inviting you, Anis, and the Analint to just arrange a platform, another webinar, in order to be able to clarify what's human rights in political usage, what are political rights in diversity, because we need to find together lots of steps in relation to that topic. Thank you very much, everyone. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you very much for your intervention. And finally, we close our panel with the famous, the big man, Stefan.
Gandalf the White. Thank you very much, Anis. It was a very interesting and a really enjoyable one. But I will start with what Angie said, that ASCA needs to make a platform. No, nothing like that. Just a meeting place. I don't want more virtual
So in
stuff.
Alexandria,
Face to face. Yes, exactly. Okay, so very briefly, just one or 2 points that, of course, I agree with all of you, is that with regard to Nadia's point, which is very important, very interesting about the university, the university recognition and accreditation. I think this is a major issue, even which is not only related to the immigrants and refugees, but also to anyone who comes from a European university, for instance, at least in Greece. So accreditation is an issue. And probably that's what I'm saying. It's probably a process that would have an attempt, it's not only recognizing the university degree, it's recognizing in relation to professional occupation. And this is an issue which goes beyond the integration of other foreigners or immigrants and refugees. That's one point. The other point I want to mention, interestingly enough, it's very interesting at times, common poverty is a unifying factor. I think I've seen this one in London in some areas where you had the coexistence of immigrants and refugees with locals. So the dire conditions gradually did not create a friction, but on the contrary, created a notion of solidarity among the inhabitants of these regions, and which and therefore where the origins, the national origin, religion was irrelevant in that case. Very good point that you've mentioned, Caroline, and definitely in terms of the cities, in terms of this intercultural dialogue to take place, we need spaces. And this is a major challenge because spaces, in many respects, especially from the private sector, is interpreted in money. And therefore, there is a need for the third sector vis-a-vis the state on the one hand and the market on the other to have to develop a strong stand with regard to this one. The final point I want to make, in terms of Angie, you've mentioned again, to my reference on the church, my point about the church is with regard not necessarily with the dogmatic nature, but with their philanthropic role in relation to the locality. That this is the point I wanted to raise, and it has nothing to do with the dogmatic, of course. And finally, another point that we did not raise here is, apart from the spaces, I just want to make a reference to a very important thing, is that the libraries is one of the domains that the Anna Lindh Foundation, I don't think it has invested a lot as a unifying factor. And it's a safe haven for many kids who would find a place not only to read, but also to have actions and so on and so forth. The importance of role models. And here I will mention as an example, a very interesting example, is that during an aggressive campaign of the fascist group, the Golden Dawn here, it was the stand of the then mayor was really ideal, who went beyond certain issues, and he led the way to other directions. So role models are essential. And the final point is that while we are doing this one and we're trying to integrate this one, we'll have to remember that by trying to bridge all these things, we don't need to create a new gap, a new divide, and this is the generation gap. So when we deal with this one, we also have to take this one into consideration, which is but in any case, we go back to what we have discussed earlier on. So it's a multifaceted, multidimensional process, and it needs, the problem for me is that with regard to other things, we have to move fast. And even though we kind of expect in creative entrepreneurship, we always say that get used to the idea that you will fail. I'm not sure we have the luxury of failing when we deal with those issues. Thank you very much again, and hope that the next time is going to be a face-to-face rather than a virtual.
Stefanos, I knew where is the face-to-face meeting. It's in our Bibliotheca Alexandrina. And
Hopefully
I
so.
think you will welcome the idea very well.
Of course.
Definitely, very good idea.
Very good, yeah.
Prepare the biblioteca, we are coming, Ingi.
Yes, yes. And the fish.
Huh? Yes, of course.
Beer and fish, yes.
Of course. Finally, thank you very much for all of you for your huge contribution and the very, very, very important contribution. We are talking today about the interculturality in the city, link with Caroline, with interculturality and the migration, territorial, social, economic space, the complexity of the concept, the climate change, how climate change affect the interculturality city, the migration should celebrating diversity, the push and pull effect of migration, different ways of migration, difference between. She focused also on the differences between in Germany between city and the other, the change of cooperation model, international city and intercultural city, urban place, how to protect identity, and should we protect or develop identity with NG. We are talking about the raising public awareness, fight racism by promotion of sustainability of also the diversity, the work on the origin of each city. NG also focus on education and the role of education on the intercultural process, and also about the cultural event, engage people, the engage policy maker, work on humanity, equality, tolerance, acceptance of other, fighting corruption also as social tools of integration, and also to manage diversity, the monitoring of change social behavior, also to develop this awareness and to erase the hate speech, etc. So integration of all differences. She talked also about the Syrian experience in Alexandria and in Egypt in general. She focused also on the sustainability, education, business also, and government, the multi-dimension of interculturality. Stefanos, he would like to move fast as all great men, the role of the city, the economic integration, the identity of the city, the religious role of the role of the religious authorities, the school, the cultural, intercultural. He talked about also the intercultural city program of EU and all other issue. I thank very much Nadia also, who talked about that the racism is not only at individual level, but structural, historical, and institutional level. Inclusion needs to be linked with the understanding now of the biodiversity. She talked about also the different stereotypes, the role of colonization also, and how we the perception of other through the historical drama and the historical accident, unfortunately, war, colonization, etc. Finally, thank you very much for your involvement, for your very, very, very interesting contribution. I'm sorry if I cut some, the time. Don't let us to talk very easy, and I thank you very much. It was a real honor to moderate this session. It was a real honor to meet all of you, and it's always a huge pleasure, and it's always a very interesting session, and very, 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 very interesting to talk with you, all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Moroccan network for this opportunity, to our brother, friend, colleague, and many other things. Wadia, see you next time, and with the virtual marathon activity of Amalient Foundation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone, and love to meet you all, I hope, sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Love to meet you too.
Thank you to Morocco, and thank you to Stefanos and to Ingi. I would very much like to meet you.
Me too, Carolina. Thank you. Stefanos, bye-bye. Anis, Wadia, thank you very much.
We keep in touch.
Can the heads of networks stay for 3 or 4 minutes? Just want to mention.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ingi, for accepting my invitation to this.
Thank you, Mirna, for your cooperation.
Okay.
I'm sending my love and my best regards to everyone through the screens. Really, it was a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So are we going to stay for more 2-3 minutes, or it's
only the heads,
now?
only the heads of network.
Yeah, just head of networks will meet together. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Ingi. Have a good day.
Bye, Carolina. Let's keep in touch, please. You can send me through mail. Yeah, please. And Stefanos as well.
Of course, inshallah.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Anis, Wadia, thank you. Bye-bye.
Just very briefly, I just want to mention this one, and I'm asking what's going on in here. We have asked for an extension for the contract. I don't know if what's going on with
I was not paid to moderate this session with you.
Yeah, I know, it's Wadia. No, and I have received, I will tell you just what's going on, and just, I have received an answer because, we asked for this extension so that we can hold the monies there, and we can hold, and said spend it in any way, and said this is ridiculous.